Dot for Short by Frieda Friedman. Copyright 1947. Chapter 1. A Coat for Dot. It was a cold, sunless day in January, and although she wore a sweater under her coat, Dot shivered. She and her older sister Fluff, who was 12, were walking homeward along Third Avenue in New York. As usual, Fluff was talking, and Dot was listening with one half of her mind and dreaming with the other half. Very often Fluff's voice, and all the street noises, too, would be swallowed by the roar of the Third Avenue L trains directly overhead. Then, after a second, the roar would gradually disappear, and Dot could hear all the street noises again: the tinkling bell of the trolley, the tooting of taxi horns, the deep rumble of big trucks, the screeching of brakes, the shouting of children. The noise did not bother Dot and Fluff. They were used to it, so used to it that they did not notice it at all. They had always lived on Third Avenue facing the L tracks, and on a rainy day when they could not go out, it was fun to watch the trains rush past. Once a train had stopped before it reached the station. Dot looked into the car, and there, looking back at Dot, was a girl her own age. The girl smiled and showed Dot through the window the book she was reading. Then the train started again, and the girl disappeared forever. A taxi horn tooted when Dot and Fluff stopped for a red light. They did not notice it until the toot was repeated 3 times, short, firm little blasts. Then the girls realized that someone was trying to get their attention. They looked up, and there was Daddy in his taxi. They waved to him, and he grinned and waved back. Then he said something to the lady passenger. She stared hard at Dot. The red light turned green, and the taxi sped away. Dot thought she knew why the lady had stared at her. She was probably wondering how Fluff, who was so pretty and golden-haired, happened to have such a short, dark, plain sister. They passed the boarded-up house. No one lived in it. The Board of Health said that it was not a good enough building for people to live in, so the door and all the windows were covered with boards. 2 boys were playing ball against the building. Their ball made a loud smacking noise as it hit the wood. Both boys stopped when the girls came near. They looked at Fluff admiringly. One of the boys called, "Hi, gorgeous," and the other chimed in with, "Hello, beautiful." Fluff tossed her head and tried to look as if she hadn't heard. Then the boys looked at Dot. "Hi, Shorty," shouted one of them, and the other greeted her with, "Hello, Peanut." Dot began to walk very quickly. She turned her head so Fluff would not notice that her cheeks had turned very red and her lips were trembling. "Slow down, silly," said Fluff. "Act as if you didn't hear them." It was good to get into the warm hallway. A radiator made a sizzling, bubbling sound. Dot and Fluff started to climb the 2 flights of stairs that led to their apartment. On the first floor, Fluff sniffed. "Mrs. Adams is having cabbage tonight," she whispered and giggled. "I wonder what we're having." In summer, when the doors were open, you knew what every family would have for dinner. In winter, though, it was only strong smells like cabbage or coffee that escaped through the doors into the hall. Just as Dot and Fluff were about to ring their own doorbell, the door suddenly opened from the inside, so suddenly that Dot almost fell in. "Boo!" shouted a small boy with bright red hair and red freckles. He was Mike, who was 8 years old, 2 years younger than Dot, who was 2 years younger than Fluff, who was 2 years younger than Peg, who was now 14 and went to high school. "It's Friday!" Mike yelled. "We don't have to do any homework. We can stay up and have dinner with Daddy. Golly, I wish I had a dog." He turned a somersault in the narrow hall, and his feet hit the wall. Mommy was in the living room, and in her lap was a hill of stockings that needed darning. The girls kissed her, and Dot thought again how pretty she was. She had always wanted to be pretty and tall like her mother and sisters. Nothing exciting would ever happen to anyone as small and dark as she was. "Come in and say hello to me," said a cheerful voice from the kitchen. Dot went in to see Grandma, leaving Fluff to tell Mommy about school and their meeting with Daddy. Grandma Fleming had plump cheeks that were pink and white like a fat baby's. She had short, curly, silver hair, and the curls jumped merrily when she shook her head. She had merry brown eyes, too. They just looked at you and knew what you were thinking. Now they looked straight at Dot, and Grandma said, "What's bothering you, Dorothea Ann?" That was one of the things that Dot loved about Grandma. Everyone else called her Dot because they said that Dorothea Ann was too big a name for such a little girl. Whenever Grandma called her by her full name, Dot straightened up and felt tall and important. "A boy called me Shorty, and another one called me Peanut," she explained. Grandma looked at Dot and pressed her lips together. She shook her head, and Dot knew that she was not going to be given any sympathy at all. "How often, Dorothea Ann Fleming, have I told you it's the size of the mind and the kindness of the heart that count? You're such a foolish girl that I can't believe you're my grandchild. Now help me put the chocolate frosting on the cake, and you can lick the spoon in half the bowl. Leave one side of the bowl for Mike." Dot loved to be in the kitchen on Friday. It was filled with such wonderful smells: the appetizing smell of meat cooking in its own juices, the delicious bakery smell of cake baking in the oven, the candy smell of chocolate in a bowl waiting to decorate the cake. Dot was sure that no kitchen in the whole world smelled as good as the Fleming kitchen did on Friday, when the whole family waited for Daddy and all had dinner together in the living room. For a few minutes while Dot worked, she forgot about the boys and the names they had called her. Grandma had taught her how to decorate a cake when she was a little girl, and she loved doing it. She dipped the big tablespoon into the bowl of delicious-looking dark chocolate. Then she tilted the spoon over the middle of the cake. The chocolate was just right for frosting, not too thin and not too thick. It began to spread from the center in all directions. Some of it ran down the sides of the cake. Dot dipped the spoon into the bowl again, and again she let the chocolate flow over the cake and down the sides. Some of it fell into the plate that held the cake. Dot wanted very much to take it up with her finger and then lick her finger the way she used to when she was small. Instead, she scooped it up with a knife and patted it onto the sides of the cake wherever a place wasn't thickly covered. Then she smoothed the top and sides with her knife until the chocolate was smooth and even, without a single lump. Dot stepped back and looked at the cake. It looked as pretty as a chocolate cake in a bakery window, she thought. Grandma seemed to agree with her. "I couldn't have done as well myself," she said, shaking her head so that her curls danced merrily. Now that her work was done, Dot's thoughts went back to her walk home from school. "Grandma," she said, "if you could have one wish, what would you wish?" "I'd wish," said Grandma without hesitating one second, "that we Flemings would always stay the same happy, healthy family that we are today." What a funny wish, thought Dot. Whenever she and her sisters and Mike wished, it was for something real, like $10 or something to wear or a dog. Dot always had another wish that she never told the others, but now she found herself telling it to Grandma. "I'd wish that after vacation is over next summer, I'd go back to school and the teacher would tell us to form a line according to our size. I'd take first place the way I always do, because I'm the shortest one in the class. Teacher would say, 'Dorothea, you've grown during the summer. Get further back.' I'd measure myself with all the other girls, and I'd be taller than anyone except the very last girl." "And why not taller than the very last girl?" Grandma asked. "Because everyone notices you and says things if you're the tallest, same as if you're the smallest." "That's a rhyme," said Grandma. "The tallest, the smallest. Well, Dorothea, your wish strikes me as being very silly. Some day you'll be glad you're small. See if you're not." "I can't imagine when," Dot answered. Now it was time to help the others pull the table into the middle of the room and put two boards into it to make it bigger. Usually the family ate in the kitchen, Mike, Dot, and Fluff eating first. Now that Peg was in high school, she ate with the grown-ups. It was exciting to have dinner with Daddy. He always had such wonderful stories to tell about the people who rode in his taxi, how they looked and what they said. Sometimes they were important people whose names appeared in the newspaper. How exciting it must be, Dot thought, to have your name in the paper. When Daddy came home, you could hear his voice above the noise of the L trains. He looked just the way Mike would look some day, with red hair, freckles, and jolly blue eyes. As he opened the door, he yelled, "I'm hungry enough to eat the first person I see. Get out of my way." Dot noticed that he was carrying a package. "If it's something for me," shouted Mike, "I'd rather have a dog." "I hope it's a dress for me. I need one," said Peg, who had come in a little earlier. She was just as pretty as Fluff, but her hair, like Mommy's, was redder and her eyes were violet color. She was tall and slim. "No looking till after dinner," said Daddy, giving Mommy a kiss. He put the package on a chair where they could all see it while they ate their dinner. All during dinner, everyone around the table, except Daddy, kept looking at the package and wondering which lucky person it was for. When dinner was over, Mike rushed for the package and was about to open it. "Oh, no," said Daddy, taking it from him. "I'll do the opening." He did, and he held up a girl's coat, a lovely plaid coat with lots of red in it, and with a pretty beaver collar. Mike's face fell. "Anyway, I knew it wasn't a dog, so I didn't care," he mumbled. "But if it's ever a dog, I get it." "It's for the one it fits best," said Daddy. "Everyone gets a chance to try it on. That is, everyone but Mike and me." He winked at Mike, and Mike grinned. "The oldest first. Come on, Grandma." Grandma put the coat over one shoulder, and they all laughed because she looked so funny. Mommy tried it next, but she could not even get her arm into the sleeve. Peg looked very hopeful and excited when her turn came. She tried her best to get into the coat, but she had to admit that it was too tight. Dot's heart began to beat faster. Fluff was really as plump as Peg, though she wasn't as tall. If the coat did not fit Peg, then maybe. It was too good to be true. A beautiful plaid coat that had not before belonged to Peg first, and then to Fluff, and then to her. No, nothing that wonderful could ever happen. "You, Dot," said Daddy, like a teacher calling one pupil after another. Dot's cheeks were very red and her eyes were very bright. An L train thundered by and swallowed the shouts that came from all of them when Dot buttoned the coat. Even Mike was jumping with joy. Daddy turned Dot around slowly so that they could all see how perfectly the coat fitted. "Look at yourself in the mirror," said Mommy, and they all went into the little bedroom that Dot shared with Peg. They filled every inch of it. Dot, looking at herself in the mirror over her dresser, could hardly believe her eyes. The coat fitted as if it had been made just for her. Red was her favorite color, too. She stroked the beaver collar lovingly. "She really is very pretty," said Grandma so low that only Mommy was supposed to hear. But Dot heard too, and almost burst with happiness. Everyone was always so busy telling how pretty Peg and Fluff were that they didn't even notice her. "Now, Jim, where did the coat come from?" Mommy asked, and suddenly Dot wished that Daddy would never tell and that it would always be a mystery. "Well," Daddy said, "I guess the girls told you I met them on Third Avenue. The woman who was in the cab thought Dot was one of the cutest kids she had ever seen. She asked how old she was, and she was surprised when I said 10. She thought she was lots younger." There it was. Dot's happiness began to fade a little. She looked at herself in the mirror again and touched the beaver collar. "The lady's name is Mrs. Roberts. She said her kid is 10 too, but much bigger. She said that her girl is getting so fat that she outgrows her clothes before she even wears them. Said she had a beautiful winter coat from last year that the girl can't even get into. I feel sorry for her kid. She's got everything, but she's so plump that her friends make fun of her. Well, anyway, the lady wanted to know if I'd like to stop and get the coat and give it to Dot. That's the whole story." Everyone looked at Dot with admiration. Dot could read Grandma's mind just as clearly as if she were reading a printed page. Grandma's eyes said, "See? Didn't I tell you that lots of exciting things are going to happen to you, Dorothea Ann Fleming?" Mommy smiled at Dot lovingly and said, "I think this is going to be a lucky year for you, Dot. It's starting that way, isn't it?" Chapter 2. The Flemings Have a Visitor. Fluff, Dot, and Mike came home for lunch every day at 12. Peg used to, but now that she was in high school, she ate in the school lunchroom. Every evening she told Dot what she had eaten and how much her lunch had cost. To Dot, eating in the school lunchroom seemed almost as thrilling and grown up as eating in a restaurant. It was much more exciting than having to hurry home every day for lunch and hurry back again. They had 45 minutes between morning and afternoon classes. That seemed long enough, but when you counted the time it took to walk home and walk back, there just wasn't enough time to eat lunch and tell a few things that had happened during the morning. The kitchen table was always set and waiting for them when the three Flemings rushed into the house. Mommy and Grandma didn't eat their lunch until the others had finished and were on their way back to school. Instead of eating, Mommy and Grandma kept an eye on the Big Ben clock that was on top of the icebox. Today they were all busily eating scrambled eggs on toast when Mike burst out laughing. All the others looked at him in surprise. No one had said anything funny. In fact, Dot, Fluff, and Mike had been so busy eating that no one had said anything at all in the last few minutes. Mike laughed and laughed. He laughed just the way Daddy did. He closed his eyes tight, screwed up his nose, threw back his red head, and howled so loudly that Dot was sure Mrs. Adams in the downstairs apartment could hear him. "What in the world is so funny?" Fluff asked. When Mike opened his eyes, they were teary from having laughed so hard. It was a second or two before he could talk. "I was thinking of the new kid we have in our class," he said. "He's French, and you ought to hear him talk." Mike held his nose with his thumb and first finger. Then he started to talk. His voice sounded as if he had a bad cold. "Will you please repeat the question, Miss Reed?" he asked. "I do not think I comprehend." Again he threw back his head and burst out laughing. More because Mike was having such a good time than because they thought the story funny, Dot and Fluff began to laugh too. Suddenly Dot realized that Mommy and Grandma were not laughing at all, not even smiling. Their faces looked not only serious but worried, the way they looked when someone in the family was not feeling well. "Did you laugh at the boy that way in school?" Grandma wanted to know. "You bet I did," Mike told her, opening his eyes. "All the kids did. We were all imitating him. Every time he said the answer, we said it after him in a whisper." Miss Reed was awfully sore, but she couldn't punish anyone because the whole class was doing it. Golly, it was fun. By now Dot understood why Mommy and Grandma were not laughing, but Mike didn't realize. He looked from one to the other and said, "What's the matter? Don't you think it's funny?" "No," said Mommy and Grandma together in exactly the same stern voice. Grandma continued, "I never expected to see a grandchild of mine so cruel. How would you like it if you were in another country and everyone ganged up on you because you couldn't speak the language the way they did?" "Just let anyone try it on me," said Mike. "That guy's a sissy. He needs a haircut. And guess what his name is? Pierre Boulanger. Did you ever hear such a name in your life?" "In France they'd howl at a guy named Mike Fleming," said Fluff, who had joined the side against Mike. "Betcha they wouldn't," Mike told her. "Mike Fleming's a swell name, and I'd punch anyone in the nose who didn't like it. This guy's too big a sissy to punch anyone." Grandma was pouring the milk from the milk bottle into 3 glasses. "Do you know, Mike," she said as she filled his glass, "if you went out west they'd laugh at the way you talk English? And if you went to Boston, and that's only a few hours away, they'd think your New York way of talking was mighty funny. I know. I went to Boston a long time ago with your grandpa, and I saw people smile at the way I talked." Mommy turned to Mike and said in her quiet voice, "I think you owe Pierre an apology, Mike. Why don't you invite him here after school?" When Mommy said an apology, all the happiness went out of Mike's freckled face. "Guys don't apologize," he mumbled. "If I did, everyone would think I'm a bigger sissy than he is. But I'll invite him home after school if you want to get a look at him." "I wish you would," said Mommy. Then she looked up at the clock. "Children, you'd better hurry or you'll be late. We've done too much talking," she said. They all rushed for their hats and coats, rushed down the hall to the door, down the steps, and 3 blocks to the school. That afternoon, after Dot and Fluff had been home for a few minutes, the doorbell rang. Dot opened the door, and in hurried Mike. There was a boy with him. The boy just stood there, not knowing exactly what to do after Mike had deserted him. Dot wished that her brother had better manners. She knew that she should say something, so she smiled and said, "I'm Dot, Mike's sister." The boy made a little bow before he answered. "I am Pierre Boulanger," he said. He sounded so exactly like Mike with his fingers pressed to his nose that Dot almost burst out laughing then and there. But she remembered in time and stopped the laugh when it was only a big smile that Pierre thought was meant to welcome him. He was older than Mike, Dot realized at once. "He must be as old as I am," she thought, and for no reason she was pleased. She knew that boys and girls who do not speak English or put in lower classes until they can catch up. Pierre was tall, thin, and very pale. Because his face was so white, his eyes looked almost black, and they were large and serious. His hair was black, and, as Mike had said, he needed a haircut. The front part of his hair kept falling into his eyes, and he kept pushing it back with his long fingers. He looks like a poet or an artist, Dot thought, and she liked him right away. As soon as he came in, he became the family's guest instead of just Mike's. Mommy held out her hand and said, "So this is Pierre. I'm very glad to meet you." She spoke as if he were a grown-up instead of a friend of Mike's. Grandma did something very odd. She looked at Pierre's thin, white face, and she kissed him on the cheek. Dot, who was watching Pierre, decided that maybe he was a sissy after all, for he flushed and looked as if he might cry. Fluff stood a little behind the grown-ups. Mommy pushed her toward Pierre and said, "This is Mike's sister, Fluff." Fluff put out her hand and said, "How do you do?" in her most grown-up voice. They all asked him questions at once. Peg returned from high school, and she joined the others in the living room. Sometimes an L train passed and drowned out what Pierre was saying, so they had to ask the same question over again. After a while, Dot was so interested in what he was telling them about France that she forgot his pronunciation was any different from theirs. "How long have you been in New York?" Mike wanted to know. Dot wondered why he hadn't asked him all week when they were in school together. "A year," Pierre explained. His parents had died in France, and he had been sent to live with relatives in the Bronx. They couldn't keep him any longer, and now he was living with cousins on Third Avenue. It was a very small apartment. The rooms faced a court instead of the street, and they had to turn on the light whenever they wanted to read. Just then an L train roared past, and the sound filled the room for a few seconds. "Anyway," said Grandma cheerfully, when the train had gone by, "if you don't face the street, you don't get the L noises. There's always a good side to everything." Pierre looked at Grandma very lovingly. "Do you like living in New York?" Dot asked shyly. Yes, Pierre liked it very much. He had been born on a farm in France, and in all his life there he hadn't seen as many people as lived in the New York apartment house where he was living now. He'd be very happy if only— He stopped and bit his lip. "If only what, Pierre?" Grandma asked. "If only I could talk English well. I try very hard to say thee instead of zee, but I often forget." Mike waved his hand as if to brush aside such a foolish worry. "Who cares about a thing like that?" he asked. "Everyone has a different way of talking. If I went out west, they'd laugh at me because I talk like a New Yorker. Even if I went to Boston, and that's only a few hours away, they'd smile at the way I talk. Ask Grandma. It happened to her." Pierre looked from one face to another. For a few seconds no one said anything, while another L train whizzed by. "Do you know you gave us the statue?" Fluff asked Pierre. "I gave you the statue?" Pierre repeated, looking very puzzled, very much afraid that his English was too poor to understand Fluff. His eyes searched the room to see if there was a statue. The nearest thing to one was the vase on the table. "The Statue of Liberty," Fluff explained. "France gave it to America. It was very nice of you." Pierre rose and bowed a little, as he had in the hall. "I am very glad you like it," he said. "Once we were in the statue," Mike interrupted. "We climbed way into the hand. I jumped up 2 steps at a time." "And we almost had to carry you down," Peg reminded him. Mike glared at her. "When spring comes, maybe all you children can visit the Statue of Liberty, and Pierre can read the inscription. It's very beautiful." It was Mommy who made this suggestion. Pierre said it would be a pleasure. They all had tea and delicious cookies that had marshmallow inside and a chocolate covering. After that, Pierre said he must go. Mike walked to the door with him to show the others that, after all, Pierre was his guest. "I'll see you in school tomorrow," the others heard him shouting down the stairs. When Mike returned to the living room, his freckled face was beaming with pride. "Nice guy, isn't he?" he asked. "Oh, yes," answered Dot so quickly that Fluff giggled and said, "Dot's got a crush." "He's a very polite boy, and you could get lots of pointers from him," said Mommy to Mike. The next day, when Fluff, Dot, and Mike sat down to lunch, Mommy took a letter from her apron pocket. "Who wants to hear a letter?" she asked. "I do. Dot replied. She loved letters. Fluff said, "Who's it for?" and Mike asked who it was from. Mommy didn't answer either question. She started to read the letter. Dear Grandma Fleming, dear Mrs. Fleming, dear Peg, Fluff, Dot, and Mike, I want to extend to all of you my sincere thanks for your hospitality. I had the best time I ever had since I came to the United States. I hope I may come often. Mike, I want to extend to you my thanks for telling the pupils not to make fun of me, although I really do not blame them. Peg and Fluff, I think you are the prettiest girls I have ever seen. Dot, the day after tomorrow is Valentine's Day, but I am sending you a valentine in this letter because I want it to be the first valentine you get. I drew it myself and I wrote the poem. I hope you will like it. Thank you all very much. Sincerely, Pierre Boulanger. Well, bless his heart, if that isn't the nicest letter, said Grandma. Then she, Fluff, and Mike looked at Dot as Mommy handed her a folded sheet of paper. Dot's cheeks burned and her dark brown eyes glowed. Pierre had said that Peg and Fluff were the prettiest girls he had ever seen, but he had sent her, Dot, a valentine. Looking down at it, she remembered that the minute she had first seen Pierre, she had known that he was either a poet or an artist. Now she found that he was both. Ain't you gonna show it to us? Mike asked, and Fluff sat on the edge of her chair waiting. Dot doesn't have to show it if she'd rather not, said Mommy. It's her valentine. Oh, you can all see it, Dot said, trying to act as if it were nothing for her to get a valentine, and 2 days ahead of time, too. Before she handed it to Mommy, she looked at it again. There was a big red heart, and in it the face of a girl with black curly hair. There was a question printed around the heart. Will you be my valentine? Under the heart was a poem. I think, Dot, you are very nice, and very pretty too. And for my valentine I want no other girl but you. Fluff looked at the valentine admiringly. That's a swell one, she said. I hope I'll get some on Valentine's Day. When the valentine was passed to Mike, he looked at it and said, I bet you're glad I invited Pierre home, aren't you? I know a good guy when I see one. Mommy looked up at the clock that had been busily ticking away, unnoticed by all of them. Children, you'd better hurry or you'll be late, she said in alarm. We do altogether too much talking at lunch hour. Fluff, Dot, and Mike rushed for their hats and coats and hurried to school. Dot put the valentine in her coat pocket and her fingers kept touching it as she walked along. The day was cold and Dot's gloves were thin, but every time she touched the valentine she felt a warm, happy glow. Just before she and Fluff and Mike reached the big red brick school building, Mike said exactly what was in Dot's own mind. Don't we have fun going home for lunch? I sure feel sorry for Peg having to eat lunch in school every day. Chapter 3 Bad News Dot had no idea when she took her seat that Wednesday morning that the day was going to be different from any other Wednesday. Between arithmetic and history, Miss Hall, her pretty teacher, said to the class, This afternoon I'll have some news for you. Can't you tell it now? Asked a boy named James Clark. That, of course, was just what Dot and the others in the room wanted to ask, but only James Clark was bold enough to do it. Miss Hall smiled and shook her head. Dot could tell by the twinkle in her eyes that the news was going to be good news. No, it will have to wait until this afternoon, Miss Hall said. Now we'll go on with the history lesson. At lunchtime, Dot told Mommy and Grandma about Miss Hall's announcement. They too wondered what the news would be. Maybe she's going to give a prize for something, Mike suggested. Maybe it'll be a dog. And if it is, and if you win, promise to give it to me, will you? Dot promised. As soon as the boys and girls in room 301 took their seats after lunch, James Clark's hand waved in the air. When Miss Hall asked him what he wanted, he said, Will you tell us the news now? Miss Hall said she would. She told them that April 13th was Thomas Jefferson's birthday, and in honor of that great American, the school was going to have an entertainment Friday evening, the day before his birthday. Anyone could come. The admission would be 10 cents, and the money would go to the Red Cross. When Miss Hall paused, there was a sigh of disappointment in the room. Everyone had been expecting exciting news, and this announcement seemed dull and uninteresting. There were programs in the assembly all the time, and they were free. Of course, they were given during school hours and no grown-ups were invited, but a school program would probably be the same, day or evening. Miss Hall looked down at the disappointed faces, and Dot thought she saw a funny little smile on her teacher's face. Every grade will be represented, Miss Hall continued. The fifth grade will have one pupil entertained too, of course. Now some of the boys and girls began to stir in their seats and pay more attention. Miss Hall went on talking. You remember, I'm sure, the composition you all wrote last week on what America means to me. The teachers of the fifth grade decided that the pupil whose composition was the best should recite it at the entertainment. I am very proud to tell you that out of all four classes in the fifth grade, someone from this room was chosen. Now there really was a stir in the classroom. Everyone sat up and looked around at everyone else, wondering who the smart boy or girl could be. Dot looked at several boys and girls who always wrote good compositions. She envied the winner for being so bright, but she knew that she would not change places with her or him. Just the thought of having to recite in the assembly in front of hundreds of people made Dot feel unhappy. Miss Hall waited a minute until the class quieted down. Then she said, the best composition was written by Dorothea Ann Fleming. Dot sat up, startled, sure that the teacher had made a mistake and said the wrong name or that she had heard wrong. But Miss Hall was looking straight at her. Dot's cheeks turned flaming red and her eyes were hot. She'd have to ask Miss Hall after school to choose someone else. She just couldn't do it. That's enough now, said Miss Hall, suddenly turning stern. The class will have to come to order and we'll go on with our geography. Dorothea, stay after class and see me, please. Dot was certainly glad that Miss Hall didn't call on her during the afternoon, for she would not have known any of the answers. Her mind kept turning to the entertainment. She kept seeing herself standing on the platform with hundreds of pairs of eyes staring at her. She saw herself making an effort to talk. At first no sound would come from her throat. She would try again and a little squeak would come out. The people would shout, louder, louder. That would make her so nervous that her teeth would chatter and she would forget every word of her speech. The people would laugh pityingly, and the rest of the Flemings, they would all come, she was sure, maybe Pierre would come too, would be almost sick with shame and sympathy. She simply couldn't do it. She would tell Miss Hall at 3 o'clock. It was harder to tell than Dot had imagined it would be. Miss Hall smiled her gayest when she was alone with Dot. Your composition was excellent, Dorothea, she said. I'm very proud of you. Dot looked past Miss Hall and stared at the empty blackboard. I don't think I want to recite, if you don't mind, she said in a very low voice that quivered because she was so excited. The happy smile vanished from Miss Hall's face. She looked thoughtful. Of course you're nervous now, but you won't be when you get up on the platform. I have great confidence in you, Dorothea. Please choose someone else, Dot begged, making knots in her handkerchief, which was wet by this time because her hands were perspiring so. Well, if you insist, said Miss Hall. But think it over and talk it over with your family. You take the composition home and show it to them. I don't want to force you to do anything just because I'm selfish. During the conversation, Dot had not been looking at Miss Hall, but now she did. What could Miss Hall mean when she said, because I'm selfish? The teacher must have seen the question in Dot's eyes, for she went on talking. You see, there were several very good compositions submitted by other teachers, too. There was a tie between you and two others. We teachers were afraid the other two wouldn't do well. They haven't good memories and they don't recite with expression. They write well, but they don't recite well. I kept telling the others that you would remember your lines and recite them so well that the fifth grade would have reason to be proud of itself. I realize now that it was selfish of me to be so determined to have one of my pupils represent the grade. On her way home, Dot wondered why this had to happen to her. Why didn't it happen to Peg or Fluff or Mike? Peg would be delighted to stand up in the assembly in front of all those people. Fluff would toss her blonde hair and recite very dramatically in the hope that a Hollywood talent scout might be in the audience. And Mike! How Mike would love to stand up in the big auditorium and shout so loudly that everyone would hear. Why did she, the only timid, nervous one of the Flemings, have to be chosen? The minute Grandma saw her, she said, Now, what's the matter, Dorothea? Something foolish, I suppose, like boys calling you names? Dot never understood how Grandma could just look at her and know that she was worried. "I'll tell you after I hang up my hat and coat," said Dot, wanting to delay the telling as long as possible. While she was putting away her hat, she heard the door open, and Daddy's voice boomed. "Hello, anybody home? I haven't got anyone in the cab, and I was in the neighborhood, so I thought I'd drop in for a cup of tea." "I want tea, too," Mike yelled. "We'll all have tea," said Mommy. "It's a cold, bleak day, and a cup of tea will taste good. We'll set the table in the living room like a party. Set places for the girls, too, Dot. They'll be in any minute." Dot followed Grandma into the kitchen. Grandma filled the big water kettle and put it on the gas range. Then she opened a closet drawer and took out a freshly ironed tablecloth, a bright one with fruit and flowers all over it. This she gave to Dot, who started to set the living room table. On her next trip to the kitchen, Grandma gave her the cups and saucers, then the knives and spoons. Dot was so happy and so busy that for a while she forgot about reciting in the assembly. The bell rang and Mike rushed to the door. "Daddy's home!" he shouted. "We're going to have a tea party. You can come if you want to." "You bet we do," said Peg as she and Fluff came in and closed the door behind them. "This is fun. A party's always more fun when it's unexpected." "Let's have an unexpected party every day, can't we?" suggested Mike, and he couldn't understand why everyone laughed at him. They all sat around the table. There was no cake in the house, but Grandma had opened a fresh box of crackers, and there was cottage cheese and blackberry jam to spread on them. The tea, with the lemon in it, was a beautiful golden color, and it was deliciously hot. Everything tasted especially good. "Dot, dear, is something worrying you?" Mommy asked. Again Dot wondered how grown-ups could tell when you were worried. All the joy went out of the tea party for Dot. She stopped spreading cheese on a cracker and asked Mommy if she remembered her composition on What America Means to Me. Mommy said she remembered it very well because it had been such a good composition. "Yes," said Daddy, his mouth full of crackers. "I couldn't write a better one myself." "Or even one half as good," said Grandma in a low voice. The remark was meant for Daddy only, but the others heard and giggled. "Well, Miss Hall wants me to recite it in this assembly at a school entertainment. It's to be in April in the evening, and all the grown-ups are invited. It costs 10 cents each to get in." Everyone around the table except Dot immediately looked happy and excited at the news. They didn't seem to understand at all. "Gosh!" exclaimed Mike, with envy in his voice. "Everything happens to you. I sure wish I could get on a platform and recite." "That's wonderful news," said Mommy, her lovely violet eyes beaming with happiness. "It wasn't possible," thought Dot, "that your own family could have so little understanding." "But I'm not going to do it," she told them. "I explained to Miss Hall. I'm so nervous thinking about it now that I can hardly talk." "You're a nut," said Fluff. "A Hollywood talent scout might be there and give you a contract." "I wouldn't take it," Dot gasped. "I'd die first." Just the thought of going so far from Third Avenue made her feel sad and lonesome. Then she had an idea, and her face brightened. "Anyway, I have no right to say the composition is mine. Peg helped me with it. Remember, Peg?" "I put punctuation marks in. I think there were 3 commas and a question mark. And you're not going to recite the punctuation marks, dumbbell," said Peg, who did not seem to realize that Dot was begging her for support. "I can just hear Dot saying, 'Abraham Lincoln, comma, first president of the United States, comma,'" said Mike. "George Washington was our first president, and this program is being given for Thomas Jefferson anyway," said Dot. "His birthday is April 13th. A Third Avenue L train rushed past, making so much noise that everyone stopped talking. It was for a minute only, but during that minute Dot had another idea. This one, she felt, would really help her. "I haven't a dress nice enough to wear anyway," she said. "Everyone else will have a new dress but me." The smiles and happy expressions faded from the faces around the table. Dot did not realize that they would all be so upset, or she might not have said it, not even to escape from reciting in the assembly. No one said a word for a minute or two. Then Mike swallowed his cracker very noisily and broke the silence. I'll give you the 38 cents I got for running errands. I was saving it for a dog, but you can have it. Dot had never seen Mike's freckled face look so serious. She wanted to hug him, but she knew how embarrassed he would be. Grandma looked at Mike lovingly, too. You keep the money, dear, she said. I have a few dollars put aside, and Dorothea can have it for a new dress. Dot knew why Grandma had been saving the money. You need that money for a new coat, she said. You told us your old one is worn thin, and you feel the cold now that you're older. I feel younger than ever, I'll have you know, said Grandma, pretending that she was insulted because Dot had called her old. And this winter is almost over now. I'll have plenty saved by next year. You're all very foolish, said Daddy. All I have to do is keep the cab out longer and all day on Sunday, and I'll pick up enough extras to pay for the dress. Everyone stop worrying. Peg and Fluff had been looking at each other, asking questions with their eyes, but saying nothing. After a while, Fluff nodded, and Peg talked for both of them. You need one day of rest, Daddy. Fluff and I have been saving for permanent waves, but we don't need them as much as Dot needs the dress, so we'll give her the money. I'm afraid you'll have to recite, Dot. Mommy hadn't said a word during this discussion of money. Now she looked from one member of the family to another, and Dot thought that her eyes looked a little moist, as if she were going to cry. You're a very lovely family, Mommy said. Any mother would be proud of you. But it's a mother's business to see about dresses and things like that. I have a little money that I've been saving in case we ever need a doctor. Thank God we haven't, so we'll use it on Dot's dress. Then if we ever do need a doctor, I'll call on all of you. Suddenly Dot burst into tears. She was thoroughly ashamed of herself. I don't really need the dress. I was just thinking up an excuse so I wouldn't have to recite. My blue dress looks all right. Grandma took her handkerchief out of her pink apron pocket and blew her nose very loudly. Mike frowned and said, Gosh, look what happened to the tea party. It started so nice. Daddy looked at his watch and jumped up from his chair. If I don't get back to the cab soon, I'm afraid someone else will, he said, and hurried to the door. When he had opened it, he called back, Say, Dot, your old man sure will be proud when you're on that stage. My teachers never asked me to recite when I was a kid. They asked me to keep quiet. Mommy and Grandma started to clear the table. We'll all get tickets, said Grandma, her eyes shining. Every single one of us, from me to Mike. We'll sit in the front, and when Dot finishes, we'll clap as loud as we can. I'll stamp my feet, too, said Mike, grinning so that his mouth seemed to reach from one ear to the other. And I'll practice whistling. Say, I wonder if Pierre Boulanger has a dime to spend. They all seemed to take it for granted that Dot would recite. They had all been willing to make sacrifices so that she could have a new dress for the evening. Certainly she couldn't disappoint so many people, and Miss Hall, too. And all that she had been thinking of was herself, and how she would feel, not how they would. She had no right to be so selfish when she had such an unselfish family. She'd try to make them proud of her. You go in your room, dear, and study your speech, said Mommy. The girls will help me do the dishes. After you've memorized it, I'll hear you recite. All at once Grandma burst out laughing. She laughed so hard that all her silvery curls danced merrily, and her eyes twinkled. Mommy looked at her and smiled. What's funny? She asked. Let me in on it, too. I was thinking of us Flemings with our extra money that no one knew anything about, laughed Grandma. Each one of us has a secret savings, and altogether I'm afraid they don't amount to very much. We're the richest family in the world, said Mommy. Not in money, of course, but that isn't too important. We're rich in the things that really count.